listeners. Welcome to Grief Out Loud. Remember the last time you tried to talk about grief and suddenly everybody left the room? Grief Out Loud is opening up this often avoided conversation because grief is hard enough without having to go through it alone. We bring you a mix of personal stories, tips for supporting children, teens, and yourself, and interviews with professionals in the grief world. Platitude and cliche-free, we promise. Grief Out Loud is hosted by me, Jana Cristofero, and produced by Dougie Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. Hey listeners, apologies for the unexpected break we took last month. And by we, I mean me, because I'm a production team of one. I was out for a bit recovering from a concussion, but I'm back and excited for the episodes coming out in the next few months. Here's the weird thing. The last time I had a concussion, it was 2019, and I was reading Nicole Chung's amazing first memoir, All You Can Ever Know, about the search to find her Korean birth family. This time around, in preparation for this interview, I was rereading Nicole's second memoir, A Living Remedy, which chronicles the lives of her adoptive parents and their deaths just 2 years apart in 2018 and 2020. Concussion recovery is a strange thing, at least it is for me. I end up feeling like I've gone somewhere, even though physically I'm in the same place. Reading Nicole's work feels similar. Her words transport readers to a particular time, space, and emotional location. You end up feeling like you're in the room with her as she winds around the contours of loss and grief. In A Living Remedy, she writes not just about her parents and the grief of losing them, but also the structural inequalities of our economic and healthcare systems that limited her parents' access to care and added deep complexity to her grief. Nicole is one of the few voices addressing the very real role that money and resources play in grief and the choices we do and don't have when it comes to being there for people at the end of life. A Living Remedy just came out in paperback last month, so be sure to get a copy wherever you connect with books. Okay, here's my conversation with Nicole. Nicole, I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. Thank you for being part of Grief Out Loud.
Thanks for the invitation.
In this moment, what feels most important to share about your parents to help us start to maybe understand them and also to understand you?
Yeah, so my father died in 2018 and my mother in 2020. So the anniversary of my mom's death is actually coming up this next month. And this is like the hardest time of year, I think, for me, in dealing with grief. It's something about how like spring hits, especially like where I live, everything's blooming. And it just, the smells and the sights and the sounds just take me like right back to that spring when she was sick. I just mentioned before we started recording, if I were to answer this question, like what's really important or what do I want people to understand about my parents, probably the answer would change like day to day, week to week. Like I'm always being like hit with some new memory. But what I think about most consistently is just the faith that they had in me and the fact that it persisted despite the fact that we had many disagreements. We had a lot of complications, I think, in our relationship. I write a little bit in both my books about being a transracial adoptee, so like the only Korean in my family, and just those obvious differences, and then the ones that were, maybe more ideological or like just a function of the distance that can grow up between you and home once you leave like that nest that your family built for you. But I really do think so much about, and like I'm still so grateful for the fact that they had this very strong belief in me and a really strong trust in me and the choices that I made for my life, even when it took me far away. My mom and dad were both very funny, and so that's something else I think about too. Very different senses of humor. My dad was this perpetual, very dry jokester. My mother's wit had this very sarcastic edge, but both of them were very warm in their humor as well. It was the kind that kind of invited people in and made you feel like at ease. So I think about that a lot too. I don't know that that's a trait that I have. I wish I did, but it was very much something that I associate with both of them in different ways.
You know, as I asked you that question, I just sat with like, okay, when I think back to to reading your book, both of your books, what stood out to me about your parents. And I was going to say faith as well, but I was thinking more from their connection to their own faith and how maybe that translated into being able to have such strong faith in you, even as you grew and became maybe different than them and explored different things or had different values in a sense.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think about that a lot as well. I grew up in their household, like also being raised very religious, and then our paths in that area diverged. Sometimes I take my mother's prayer book out just to like look at it and thumb through it. It's not, I didn't share her faith. I didn't pray those prayers with her, but it always like makes me feel closer to her, like looking at that. And she had a cross necklace that she wore, like, I mean, for as long as I can remember. And I take that out and I look at it a lot too. And I think what you're saying is absolutely true. Like I also associate that faith so strongly with them. And in my mind, it is sort of linked, right, with their faith in me. Obviously, very different types, but they had the ability to believe very, very strongly, like just to believe that certain things were true. One of those things was in me. And so I think that gave me a really strong foundation then for trying to learn how to have like that same trust and faith in myself.
When I think about death and grief and loss, those experiences can never be extracted from the context in which they occur. And as I was reading your book and listening to other interviews, the sense of the context for the fact that when your dad was ill and getting close to the end of his life, you were in a space where you could not kind of economically support or contribute to your parents in that way. And then your mom, her illness at the beginning of the pandemic, and then not being able to be there with her for care, and even after her death, in terms of all the things that we heard about and doing virtual services and those different aspects of the early pandemic. And I'm just wondering, like, how do you think now about those circumstances and how they shape your grief?
A friend said to me, like, and it was a while after my mom died that she said this. She said, like, your grieving experiences were almost inverses of each other. The fact that when my father was sick and when he died, it might have looked, I hesitate to say it like conformed to like our expectations of grief, but like, and I'd obviously never lost a parent. And when that happens, it is this cataclysm. It's different for everyone, but like, I went through the rituals and the experiences for the most part that I would have expected to, if I and I did spend like years not imagining exactly, like fearing losing him because I knew he wasn't well. I didn't know when the end would come. Obviously, we never have that knowledge, but when it happened, in certain ways, it fit what I'd expected. I flew home right away, with my family. We were there with my mom. My mom and I looked through pictures and cried together. We did those things you do when you're planning after someone's death. We talked about the funeral service. We talked about, the burial. I had a lot of questions about like what her wishes were and like making sure those were honored, So, and I stood next to her when we watched his casket being lowered into the ground, like just these memories that, again, it's not like I had imagined them so many times, but like they're familiar. They're familiar to anybody who's experienced a loss, or for that matter, anybody who's like consumed popular culture where like a loss is depicted. And you're right that like I wasn't able just at that point in my life to be of as much practical assistance as I wanted to be. When my mother passed away, it was like the reverse. I had counted on physically being there. I thought because she had cancer as well, that when the end was close, it would be obvious. So even though I lived across the country, I figured her caregivers, her hospice staff, my family members who were closer, I assumed I would find out and I would fly there. And in my imaginings, I would always get there on time at least, to hold her hand and be there and say goodbye and then go through all those expected rituals that we go through when someone dies. And instead, because she entered hospice right around the time the coronavirus, like the first cases were really being found and reported. And she passed away in the spring of 2020. So her funeral was one of many that was live streamed with a very, very small number of in-person attendees, and I wasn't able to be there. Um, and at the same time, by then, it was only 2 years separating my parents' deaths, but I had like those 2 years, there were differences, changes in my career, and I just had the resources. Like I was by that time financially supporting her pretty much, which I'm so grateful still to have been able to do. But yeah, in terms of like the time I got to spend with them, like how it fit with like my expectations, maybe, or even my wishes of what public grieving would look like, how much I was able to be of practical help, like how often I was able to visit, like all those things were sort of like opposite between the two losses of my parents. I never would have predicted that. It was just like the circumstances that we found ourselves in at the time.
Do you have a sense, Nicole? It seems, at least from someone who was reading your book, I felt like kind of the emotional reaction to your dad's death and then the emotional reaction to your mom's death, while similar, but were also quite different. And I just wondered if, do you feel like the circumstances played a role in that? Or is that just like the nature of like the first time versus the second time having a parent die?
Oh, it's so hard to say. I mean, I didn't feel like my father's death prepared me for my mother's, you know? So maybe not so much the second time around. Another key difference is that my father's death felt sudden. At least like we didn't know the day or the hour it was going to be. We knew he wasn't well, but he had not been well for years. And I also understood his condition to be stable. And that's also, what my mother thought. And so there was the sense he was getting slowly sicker and not going to get better. And that was already hard enough. When he died, it was like quietly, peacefully, thankfully, painlessly in his sleep one night. And it was just such a shock, to both my mother and me. And there was something about the suddenness of that. I would never say like I don't think it's like helpful to say it's harder than my mother's death from cancer, where we had a lot of advance warning. And it was a period of months, but it was still like a constricted period of time. I wouldn't say like one is easier than the other, certainly emotionally, but something about the suddenness of my father's, it just felt like, I don't know, like my world just like it changed overnight. Obviously, my mom's did too. And I could not keep up with it. To go from this world where my father was alive and I thought he would be alive for some time, and then to wake up in a world where he was gone, where I hadn't known, where I couldn't like go there and say goodbye. I had no idea it was that close. There was just, he was here one day and gone the next. It was just, I think my reaction, there was so much shock and there was so much regret over what I had not been able to do to help him, like to save him. It was the first like major loss of my life in that way. And all of that just conspired, I think, to make it, I had to learn how to grieve, like kind of from scratch there. And it was a really, really wrenching process. With my mother, of course, I had been through a parental loss. Again, it doesn't prepare you, nothing does. And I was terrified. I remember of living in this world without either of them. Like, I just did not know what that would even look like. Something about, I don't know, some of my mother's strength and her faith, and just like what we were to each other, and the fact that maybe we had warning, like maybe there was a piece of it that because of the nature of her disease, we knew it was coming. It was not easy or easier, but there was a sense we were going through this together a little bit, even though I wished I lived closer, and the pandemic, when it hit, it prevented me from like being with her the way I wanted to be. But like leading up to that, and I was able to visit a lot while she was sick. She was even able to fly out and see like my family and me when she felt well enough to do that. Like we went back and forth a lot. And we were both still grieving my dad. He'd been gone like less than a year when she got cancer. So we were in this perpetual state, I think, of grieving together and then grieving this new separation that was coming. And I don't know. I do remember feeling like it was something that she was almost helping me through or teaching me how to do, even though my mother fought fought grief and fought death, like with everything she had. I wouldn't say she was like this person who calmly accepted or like helped or told me I should calmly accept, but still, like we were going through it together to some degree, and that was maybe that just helped in some way. I don't know. Sorry, that was like a long, rambly answer, but like I haven't gotten that question before, so I was like,
Those are my favorite kind of answers. As you were talking, I was picturing like almost like you and your mom acclimatizing to this new landscape of grief in a way that you did not have that with your dad because it was such a shock and came out of nowhere. And you mentioned that you were grieving together. Are there ways, what did you learn about grief from watching your mom and her grief?
laughter is like a weird reaction, but I think a lot about like all the dark jokes she made about death. I'd mentioned her sense of humor before and how it could be a little bit sarcastic. And, one of the prolonged, I don't know if argument's the right word, but like intense discussions we'd had while she was sick and even while she was dying was that we hadn't gotten my father a headstone yet. It was something that I didn't want to do without her, and she really didn't want to do. I was never even totally clear on why. I don't think it was like denial or anything like that. I think she had a lot on her mind. I think she had a lot to do, and then she was battling cancer, and she would say, like, I don't know why it matters to you so much, like I'd invented this tradition of marking graves. Like for one thing, I couldn't find his grave like without it. It was really difficult for me. I have no spatial awareness. And so, we would go back and forth about this. And like at one point she said, if you wait long enough, you can get one for both of us at the same time. And I was just like, I can't believe you said that to me. But like right in the middle of a kind of argument about it. But that was like who she was. And like her last months were filled with things like that where I did not see the humor at all, especially like at the time. But looking back, like these things crack me up. It's just, I don't know. I learned from her that sometimes there can be like funny aspects, strange and heartbreaking still, but like funny aspects to grief, or at least ways that like you joke about the things that are causing you the deepest pain, and that's partly how you get through them. Like that is very much something I sort of like picked up from her, almost against my will. It's hard. Like I really saw, like I witnessed firsthand too when I was able to visit, just how hard she fought, like, and how my mother, I don't think ever would have like independently reached a place of like peace with her situation. And she shouldn't have had to. As I told her, it was a horrible situation. Like she shouldn't have had to like somehow be okay with it. I thought, and I think with my father, like he did reach a place where he knew he wasn't getting better and had sort of made his peace with it. And like she never did. And so I suppose another thing I sort of learned from her, it's an indirect lesson, it's just the many different ways that we face like what's going to be the last battle for all of us. Um, there are different types of ways to face it, and none of them are really wrong. It's she was like herself until the end, and she was like such a fighter. I just learned something from her, I guess, about how we face those moments.
One thing that comes through pretty strongly in your writing is how you grappled with guilt and regret around both of your parents' deaths, and whether it was this kind of pervasive feeling of things could have been or should have been preventable, or this like more amorphous, like I should have done something different than I did. And, and I get like on a cognitive level, we can all get like, it's truly not my fault. And the body and the heart have different things to tell us oftentimes. And so just curious, like, what was it like to reckon with both guilt and regret?
I think the biggest thing is that I sort of had to, especially with my dad, like learn the difference between the two and like learn what I could continue to live with and what I couldn't. So at some point I realized like I might always like regret certain things I couldn't do for him, or even certain decisions I made that helped create the circumstances where I couldn't do more. But it's not the same thing as me being guilty, or at least accepting or living with that guilt forever, because I think the latter would like destroy me. And for some time after his death, it really did. I mean, I wrote about this in the book too, but just like I was in a deep, deep depression after he died. And when I tell people this, by the way, they're like, well, of course you were depressed. Your father had died. But in my case, what I thought was actually grieving. I didn't actually know better because it was my first major loss. I was like, oh, like it's normal to not want to wake up in the morning and to not want to do anything and to think about walking into traffic several times a day because my father's just died. And like, I'm not saying I'm the only person to have gone through that, but I don't think that I was really grieving in those like desperately low points. I think what I was doing was something else. It was almost like an avoidance of grief. It was almost like it's so painful. I'm just going to keep myself in this place where I'm punishing myself. You know, that's something. It's almost like I imagined I had like control over that or something. Like the depth of grief was just so scary and unprecedented in my life. And but blame, like self-recrimination, thinking it's all my fault, and if I'd just done XYZ differently, that was super familiar. You know, that was a groove I could fall back into. It's just that in that case it made me severely depressed and just thinking like, oh, I don't deserve, you know, the things that I have when I couldn't help him. So learning the difference between having regret and being guilty, that was very important. I'm an only child. It's always been me and my parents. And I grew up in a family that was paycheck to paycheck, like as I write, emergency to emergency. So I think I always had some of that only child and some of that working class kid pressure or idea that I would grow up and take care of my parents. Like that was never really what they told me they expected. It was more like what I expected of myself. And I was also raised in a fairly conservative family with all of these bootstrapping myths about like hard work in America and achievement, even though it often hadn't worked out that way in our family. That these are stories, ideas I was raised with. So for many years, I just thought if I work hard enough and pay my dues, I'll be able to take care of them. And like, of course, the reality was like very, very different. Not just because I went into the creative, you know, I was working in publishing, like not the most lucrative, and I hadn't had like a big break yet, but also, you know, my parents started to have more financial and health problems much younger than I thought would happen, right? While I still had very young kids and like school debt, and like while my husband and I were trading places in grad school and all that, I really I don't know. I was able to help my mother much more, but like with my father, it just, the ability to help just came a little bit too late. And so that was another thing I had to kind of learn to live with because I had no choice. And like, again, back to that idea of maybe having certain regrets or like wishing I could have known the future, known kind of what to try to plan for. And then the reality that we never have a way of knowing that. And I know that like it wasn't my fault. But it was definitely like a lesson I had to learn.
Was there anything practical in that learning, Nicole? Because I think, as you know, I imagine there's many listeners who are like, oh, yeah, that self blame track, much more familiar than the deep, vast unknown of sorrow and loss and grief. So that looks, I'm going to go over here. And I just wonder if there's anything tangible that you found that was supportive of you in making that recognition between guilt and regret.
That's a really good question. I mean, some of it was just like finally starting to open up and talk with a therapist. I finally got a really good grief therapist. And talking with friends. And I guess for me, it was especially helpful to talk with friends who also came from like similar circumstances where they might have expected to be like the family breadwinner or the family retirement plan. And then seeing how like your expectations actually measure up to reality there and the way odds are stacked against like working families in so many ways. So some of it was honestly just like learning to, I knew about, but like really being able to name these like systemic structural failings and realize that like, you know, they did play a role in especially my father's death, but like in my mother's as well. And that neither they nor I were like responsible for the things they were up against. And none of us could have like countered that on our own. We live in a society that tells you you can, that says that, if you just work hard enough and try hard enough and like really deserve it or deserve it more than other people, you'll have resources, you'll have support, you'll have the healthcare that you need. But that's just not how it works out for like for so many people. So also recognizing that like my family wasn't alone in our experiences was something that was helpful. And then just like time, and I think I've already mentioned, but like hard, annoying work in therapy. It took a really, really long time to like especially learn to stop punishing myself and thinking that punishing myself was like a good way of grieving. So yeah, but I mean I can't name like a particular month or session or conversation that really did it. It was a lot of things at once that eventually helped shift my thinking.
And Nicole, you're kind of one of the few people who articulates in so much detail the way economics plays a role in illness, access to resources, and then, preventable deaths, basically. And I just wondered if you could share a little bit more about like your knowing of that. It seems like you kind of had a sense of it growing up, but it's like you said, looking back and reflecting and putting in your dad's experience into context really brought that to the surface.
Yeah, so as my parents, they did have health problems while I was still at home in high school, and so I witnessed those. My father was diagnosed with diabetes when he was younger, and I learned about like the kidney disease that runs in his family. And my mother she had breast cancer, and then like less than 2 years later had a bunch of reproductive health issues, largely untreated, in the same way my father's diabetes was for years. And so, she had an emergency hysterectomy less than 2 years after breast cancer treatment, and it was incredibly traumatizing for her, I think, in ways I didn't fully recognize at the time. And what I remember too about like these terrifying periods was like the months and the years after when I was still home and like, realizing that there were like such a thing as debt collectors and they were calling because the medical debt had accumulated so much. And my parents went through periods of unemployment and there just was never enough money really to make a dent in those bills. And we almost never had health insurance. It's a really common plight, of course, for like many, many families. It used to be even more common like before Obamacare. But I don't know, like it's not something I thought about a lot growing up until we started having health problems, or my parents did. I was like young and like had the privilege of health and like just didn't think about the fact that I didn't go to the doctor very often. And, but at some point, like I think it was as soon as college or maybe even just after, like it hit me, my father was getting sicker. And I realized like things aren't getting better for them, which sounds like an obvious thing to say. But what I mean was, I looked around and so many people I knew, like their families were on maybe it was slow and steady, but like essentially an upward trajectory. Like they could expect to like continue to get their cost of living raises and like put money away for retirement. And even if they weren't wealthy, their situation wasn't getting worse. I became conscious of the fact that for my parents, things were getting worse. So if someone lost a job, the next job they got, it was for less money. All of their health problems, like because they'd gone untreated for so long, like those kept getting worse. And then like the kind of treatment they could then pay for in like a crisis, like they could pay for less of that. And then it came down to decisions like, do we buy insulin for my dad or groceries, Again, I don't want to say like these are not unique. These are shamefully common problems in American society. I think just as I was getting older, I was like becoming more aware of them. As for why I wrote about it in the book, I was surprised reading memoirs and other books about grief where this really wasn't talked about or acknowledged. And, the reality is that most of us in this country, we're not wildly wealthy. So even if people have like more economic privilege than my parents, families are facing health crises and other crises without the resources that they need. Even those of us who are privileged enough to have like good health insurance, like mine's wildly expensive. I sometimes find myself saying, well, like I'm not going to bother to go again this month because like I haven't met the premium and like I'm tired of paying these bills, it doesn't seem urgent enough, so I won't go. Like and I recognize too I'm in a really privileged position, but like we aren't, even those of us with health insurance, like we don't get the care really that we need or that we pay for. And to me, it just would have felt dishonest and like not telling the whole story to share this, in part because there's really no facing my grief for my father without acknowledging these like structural failings that helped lead to his death. In the same way, I can't really write about my mother's death without writing about the pandemic. For both of them, like it was part of the story, theirs and mine. And I know it's so common, like it's something that so many American families experience.
Well, for my part in the field, I'm so grateful you did really talk about that aspect of grief because I, like you said, I think it's one that just goes unspoken, maybe is slightly understood, but mostly unspoken. So very grateful.
I mean, even with my mother, where I was in a position where I was able to help much more. We couldn't like handle anything that came up, but like it was definitely enough to like help and support her for a while. Even with that, I remember like this point at which like she needed home health aides for part of the day, not even 24 hours. She had caregivers during the day and she needed home health aides at night so that her caregivers could get sleep. And the cost is astronomical, as you probably know, as many of your listeners probably know. And I like did the math and realized like in like 6, 8 weeks, this could bankrupt like all of us. At some point it's just going to be beyond what we can afford. I don't know, like that was like with all of our privilege and with my mother by then being on Medicare, and all these things, like it just, there just like wasn't enough. And I remember realizing we had like enough money for her to like live for like a certain number of weeks. And it's a wild thing to realize. Like you just literally don't have the money past a certain point. Yeah, what it costs to die in this country as well is something that again I felt needed to be in the book.
The other piece of your story, Nicole, that you've written about in your first book, All You Can Ever Know, is about being a transracial adoptee and having how the grief of that was like part of your experience from the earliest part of your life and being a through line into this experience of your parents dying. So, how, when you think about that grief, how does it feel maybe similar or different versus the grief of your parents dying?
I would never say that we make like enough room for people grieving a death, like the loss of a loved one in our society. I don't think we do a great job with that. I think it's a subject people like to move on from or avoid a lot. It can just feel really rare to have space and time to have conversations like this about it. But I think grief as an adoptee or adoption related loss, which I felt for as long as I can remember, although I didn't really have the like vocabulary to describe it when I was very young, like I wouldn't have phrased it that way. But I was missing and like grieving these people who were supposed to be there, like my birth family, and wondering why they weren't there and like, was it something I had done? And just like imagining them and thinking about what my life would be like if I knew something about them, all these things. There are like real losses in adoption, and there wasn't really any space and still is very little, I think, generally to acknowledge that and to talk about it. And a lot of times when adoptees do talk about it, I think sometimes people don't want to hear it because it makes them, we have a very generally like pro adoption view in our culture, and it makes people question sort of like question the institution or the practice if all of these adoptees, I'm not saying, I'm not trying to like speak for everybody, but if you're having those feelings as an adoptee, people sometimes react and in ways that shut it down because they would rather have this simple, straightforward narrative where people wanted a baby and they got a baby, you needed a family and you got a family, happy endings all around for everybody, and they don't want it to be more complicated than that. But not only does that erase birth families and what they may or may not have wanted, and quite often birth families would prefer, like strongly prefer to have their families stay together. Like a family that places a child for adoption, I think a lot has to go wrong first in most cases for that to happen, right? And it doesn't really make space for like feelings that adoptees have, including grief and or like a sense of loss or a sense of confusion. So I think one of the main differences is like, I don't know, like I've found space to talk about grief, even to talk about it publicly. My grief from my adoptive parents because they've died. There are still people who often don't really want to hear or make space for conversations about grief and adoption or like the losses that are inherent in it. And I think that does need to change because again, every adoption, no matter how loving the family, it starts with that initial loss. Like first, this child loses everything and everyone that they came from. And I think like that's something that really needs to be acknowledged and talked about more openly.
Are there ways, Nicole, in which being adopted, being an adoptee, well, I'm going to use the word you use, kind of complicates or makes it more complex the way you have to interact with other people saying things to you about the fact that your parents have died?
For sure. I mean, there are definitely some moments, a lot of people in my daily life, because I lived so far from my parents, and like they might not, like they just don't know me in the context of my adoptive family. So for people who don't know I'm adopted, sometimes there are comments based on assumptions that in most people's cases are true. I remember, and sorry, I mentioned this in the book as well, but like somebody after my father died saying like you'll still see him, he'll live on in your children. And in my case, that's not true. It was a kind thing to say. Like I certainly wasn't offended. Like I understood where it was coming from. But like little things like that. And also I think just the big way is that most people don't think about the fact, so they don't acknowledge the fact that this is like the second set of parents I have lost. And just because I lost the first when I was too young to remember, it doesn't mean that's not a loss. Again, it doesn't mean it doesn't like live in me. I don't know. It's just a different kind of a loss because the absence has been lifelong. There was no like sudden shocking removal. It has just simply always been this absence. And so I think that's something too that I don't always like bring that into conversations about grief, but it is something that many people don't acknowledge because they don't know that I'm adopted, or they know, but it doesn't occur to them, that this is my second time having lost parents.
It makes me think of when folks have a set of circumstances where they have to like explain, to like give more context, more information. And it's like so much
Oh,
burden on the
yeah.
person who's grieving to have to be like, well, here's all the stuff you need to know in order to get what I'm going through.
That is so tiring. And like I understand too when people ask or when you feel like you should explain, like often it is because they are trying to make space for you. It is because they do care. But oh man, just like explaining my parents well enough or like trying to get at our relationship well enough so that people understand the loss. I mean, that's really hard. I feel like it's a lot of labor. And like there are definitely times I feel up for it and times when I just don't. And it's something I kind of carry on my own. Or like I think about telling a story, but then I don't because it would require so much explanation first. No, that's very real, like kind of that fatigue and that sense of like, yeah, I don't know if I also feel it because I'm a storyteller, but like the whole like I have to summon just the right words to like make them real and make them live and do them justice. And it can just feel like too big of a task sometimes.
Well, in a sense, like you are now the storyteller of three or of five. In a sense, when your parents were alive, you might tell stories jointly where they would share part of it and you might share part of it. And now all of that is on you to find exactly the right words or tenor or description to help people experience two other people that aren't here in the room with them.
It's true. And like I have a large extended family, but for various reasons, mostly having to do with lack of money and us being in this little remote corner of the Pacific Northwest when I was growing up. Like we didn't often see and weren't extremely close with, many people. So, and the people we were close to, like they're gone now as well. Like my maternal grandmother lived across town from us, and I was really close with her growing up. She actually passed away a month before my mom in 2020, and I recently lost my mother's sister. So like those four people were really the only people in our family who like knew me as a child. So there's also this feeling of like there's no one to help me remember or tell me about things I was like too young to remember. Like what I have now, what I know now about my adoptive family, it's pretty much what I'm going to know for the rest of my life. There's like no one else to ask. And it does kind of make me regret not like giving everybody the third degree, when I had the chance. But I don't think of course, we don't go through life thinking that way. I don't know that like that's something else too that I think about. I was recently wishing I knew more about my maternal grandfather who passed away when I was a baby and anyone I could have asked about him. is also gone. It's like something else that I think about a lot.
Some people will read a memoir like yours and think, oh, phew, she got all that grief out and writing about it. She must be in such a great spot now. She was able to write it. So I wonder what it's been like for you to kind of go out on the quote unquote road and like promote your book and talk with people and interact with, do all these interviews and kind of, I don't know if you run into that expectation of like, oh, good, you wrap that all up, published, put it on the shelf.
Like very few people like will have come out and said like, oh, like you got it out of your system, you know? And I think a lot of people do realize how inaccurate that would be. But for sure, I get the question a lot. And almost every memoirist does to some degree, like, is this cathartic for you? And like it's really not. There are types of writing that are cathartic for me. Like I would say journaling is a good example. Or, I feel like the art of like long letters and emails is a swiftly dying art. But like I don't know, I remember I used to like have people that I would write back and forth with, like friends when I was little, pen pals, or like relatives who were far away. And I always really felt like that was a chance also to like reflect on what had been going on and how I felt about it and like try to find the right words to make another person see it. So, those types of exercises I think are really useful and can be cathartic. Sometimes my therapist assigns me little writing assignments and like they're not going to get published. Like that's not what they're for. Like they're just for me. But writing a book, it's not, for me, it is not catharsis. It can be a reckoning in some way. But by the time I decide to write about something publicly, in most cases, like I have to have gotten to a point where it's not just for me. Like catharsis would be for me, but a book is for anybody. A book needs to be for readers too. Actually, even more for them than it is for me. It needs to give them something to hold on to. And I found it easier with my first book because my options never settled, right? But there was more that was settled. And I was writing about events that were like 5 to 10 years in the past. And I wrote a living remedy in the throes of really deep, immediate, like active grief. I didn't write very much for 6, 7 months after my mom died, but then I got like back into it. Yeah, I mean, it's a book that was written sort of about grief while I was going through it every single day. So no, I don't really think it's cathartic. It's interesting to get those questions, but to your other, point about what it's like to go on the road and to get to meet readers and to talk with them, in certain ways that feels similar to the first book, where like I had all these adoptees or adoptive parents or people who had connections to adoption, and they would come up and they would want to talk to me and like share a story or a memory. Or I had so many, I still do, I have so many adoptees tell me like your book was the first time I saw anything like my own experience or my childhood or whatever, my family, like the first time I saw that in literature. And mine is obviously not like the first grief book out there, but there are aspects it takes on that, like as we discussed earlier, haven't been as well covered, I guess, in books. And so I've had a lot of people come up and want to talk about that, about like, only children, like struggling to try to like have hard conversations with parents and take care of them and feeling like the world's on their shoulders, and people with varying levels of economic privilege who just like don't have what they need or don't have what they need to help their families. People who watched loved ones get poorer and sicker and just like felt helpless to do anything substantial to assist. So like I've heard, I don't know, a lot of stories like that, and also just stories from people like grieving who tell me about their loved ones or their like last goodbyes. And I would say that it's emotionally intense to go to an event and know that I'll be holding some of these things, some of these stories. It feels like a privilege too. And I wrote this book to keep people company. I would say like especially people going through a loss or like a family crisis. And so to know that it's done that or is doing that for some people, that feels very affirming because that's why I wrote it. So I really treasure those moments of connection when people tell me that it helped them feel less alone or it was just a good companion to them in their grief. That's really what I hoped for when I wrote it.
When I talk with other authors like yourself who have written a memoir about grief and then kind of go out on the book promo land. I always think of it as this little traveling peer grief support group that goes around the world. Like every book reading, there's going to be at least 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 people that come up to you after and want to share about their experience. And I'm like, it just sort of warms my heart a little bit at these little mobile grief support groups happening.
Yeah, I mean, and like it also just feels, I don't want to say like a luxury or something, but again, like back to the point about our culture not making a lot of space in many ways for grief. Certainly the fact that grief's not linear, it's continuing. Like it's not like you're fine when your bereavement leave ends and you go back to work or whatever. It's just, I think it can be really hard to find room to have these conversations that are very honest and very raw and very truthful about what grief is and how it feels. And so it also feels like a little bit of a privilege to get to be part of those conversations, even when they're very difficult.
And Nicole, you mentioned that, springtime is really challenging and you're heading into the 4-year anniversary, right, of your mother's death. And I'm just curious if you have a plan this year for what you're going to do that day.
I was invited to do an event and I realized what day it was and like backed out. So I'm thankful that I did that. The day itself tends to be hard for me, although in a way the lead up is worse. I don't know. I wanted to keep that day like work free, even though of course I was like glad to get the invitation to speak. It felt like too much still to actually try to do it on the day. But because my paperback is coming out April 30th, it's not going to be a season of rest and relaxation for me. So I think it'll be like one more sort of spring that is a sprint. The hardcover came out last April. So in terms of my like emotional well-being, like the exact wrong time of year. But anyway, that is happening again. Publishing timelines are what they are. But I am like trying to like take care of myself and really think like, okay, what am I saying yes to? Paperback is also like a lot. It's just more low key than a hardcover. So like my tour is smaller. I think it'll be like a hard couple months. But again, I'll get to have these conversations that I want to have and like wrote the book to be able to encourage and make space for with other people. And then I'll come home and like try to find my peace again. But yeah, I've kind of accepted that this season and this anniversary, it's right in the middle of my paperback tour. So I'll try to make space how and where I can. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
Well, Nicole, thank you so much for making time to talk with me and to talk with our listeners and for just sharing so much more about your experience and for your book. I'm just like so grateful for your book. But yeah, thank you for your time today.
No, thank you for yours. I'm really grateful to you for inviting me, and this was wonderful.
And listeners, I will put lots of links to Nicole's work in the show notes, but make sure you check out A Living Remedy, which is the newest book, and then All You Can Ever Know, her previous book. And yeah, thank you, listeners. I thank you each and every time for being part of our experience, for listening to the show, for sharing episodes with people that you think might be interested in what we are talking about here. As always, you can reach out to me at griefoutloud@dougy.org, which is dougy.org. It's also our main website where you'll find information about our local programming, all of our free downloadable resources, and of course, each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. Excited as always to share that the podcast is sponsored in part by the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.